The snowstorm raged with unrelenting force, and no one in their right mind would dare step outside in such a tempest. Yet there they were, two little girls, cold, terrified, and on the brink of desperation. Lily, her face red from the stinging cold, pounded weakly on the door, her little fists numb from the impact. Beside her, Sophia, her older sister by just a year, shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering as she clutched a torn scarf around her neck. The door in front of them was their last hope, their last chance. They had run for miles, their feet dragging through the snow, but they couldn't find shelter. The night had swallowed up all sound except the howl of the wind. "I'm so scared, Lily," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm as she hugged her sister tighter. "What if we can't get inside?" Lily could barely respond, her breath shallow and her face pale from the freezing cold. But there was one thought that kept her going. The soldier. She had heard stories of the kind man who lived behind this door, the one who had helped people in trouble before, the one who had a dog, a strong dog that could protect them. She had to believe he would help them now. Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. Leave your country name in the comments below. And if you love stories about courage, loyalty, and community, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. "Please," Lily cried out into the wind, pounding harder on the door with renewed strength. "Please help us, we're freezing." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps in the snow reached their ears. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a tall, imposing figure. It was him, the soldier. Ethan Cole, 35 years old, his stern face framed by a thick beard, appeared in the doorway. His camouflage uniform was slightly faded, but the determination in his eyes remained as sharp as ever. His loyal canine, Shadow, stood silently beside him, its dark eyes focused on the two girls, sensing their fear. The soldier's gaze softened as he looked at the two shivering figures in front of him. Without a word, he stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. "Get inside, quickly," he said, his voice deep and calm. Lily and Sophia rushed inside, eager for warmth, but they could hardly move their frozen limbs. As soon as they stepped into the warmth of the cabin, the cold that had gripped them so fiercely seemed to release its hold, but the fear and exhaustion remained. Ethan closed the door behind them, glancing at the storm outside with a silent sigh. Shadow remained at his side, watching the girls with silent understanding. The storm would pass, but the lingering chill of their fear would take longer to shake off. The girls sank into a corner near the fire, their chattering teeth subsiding slowly as warmth returned to their frozen bodies. The soldier set about making them something hot to drink, his movements quiet but efficient. Shadow lay at his feet, always alert, watching over them as the soldier worked. Lily's voice broke the silence. "Are you going to help us?" Ethan paused, looking over at her with a slight nod. "Of course, you're safe here, but you need to rest. We'll talk later." But as the girls finally began to relax, a soft whimper came from outside, almost lost in the storm, but sharp enough to catch Ethan's attention. Shadow stood up, growling low in its throat, its ears perked. "Stay here," Ethan said quietly, turning toward the door. "I'll check it out." But before he could open the door, a voice shouted from outside, "Help, please!" The voice was weak, trembling with fear. Ethan's eyes flickered to Shadow, who was already moving toward the door, ready to follow. Ethan opened the door slowly, stepping out into the cold, his breath fogging in the air. He was met by the sight of a figure, another person collapsed in the snow. It was a man, large and heavily cloaked, his face hidden under a hood, blood dripping from a wound on his side. Ethan quickly rushed to his side, calling for Shadow to stay back as he knelt down to assess the situation. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded. The man struggled to raise his head, his voice hoarse and weak. I was looking for shelter." Ethan glanced back at the door. The girls were safe for now, but they couldn't stay hidden in here forever. He had to make a decision, and fast. "Come on," Ethan said, lifting the stranger to his feet with surprising strength. "We'll get you inside, but you need to stay quiet." The storm continued to howl outside as the soldier led the stranger inside, closing the door against the raging wind. Shadow gave a low, cautious growl, standing between the soldier and the stranger, but Ethan patted his head, giving the dog a reassuring glance. The cabin was small, but it was warm. The fire crackled softly in the corner, a slight glow dancing across the room. The two little girls huddled together near the fire, their eyes wide as the soldier returned with the man. "Who is he?" Sophia asked, her voice shaky but curious. Ethan looked down at the man now seated in front of the fire, his breathing steadying. "He's a traveler. He needs help. But you two are safe now, don't worry." Lily clutched her sister tightly, her eyes still haunted by the storm outside. But as she looked into the fire, something stirred within her, a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the miracle they needed. As Ethan took his place near the door, ready for whatever might come next, a soft whisper came from Lily's lips. "I'm so scared," she said quietly. The storm outside continued to rage, its fury intensified by the howl of the wind. But inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire began to soothe the girls. Ethan, sitting by the door with his rifle resting across his knees, glanced over at the stranger, his face a mix of exhaustion and concern. The man was still silent, his breath coming in shallow, labored gasps. Lily and Sophia were no longer shivering, but the fear still lingered in their eyes. Sophia had her arms wrapped around Lily, protective as always, her mind clearly racing. The silence in the room was broken only by the crackle of the fire, the wind outside, and the occasional shift of Shadow, who stood watch, his eyes scanning every corner of the cabin. "I can't believe we're safe," Sophia murmured, her voice heavy with relief. "I thought we were going to die out there." Ethan's gaze softened as he glanced toward the girls. He knew all too well what it was like to feel that kind of hopelessness. Shadow padded over to them, lowering his head so that the girls could pet him. They did so without hesitation, the dog's warmth offering comfort they hadn't known in days. "You're safe now," Ethan said quietly. "We'll get through this." But his mind was already working. He knew the stranger's injury was serious. The blood on his side was dark, and it hadn't stopped flowing. He would need to tend to him soon. Sophia and Lily, comforted by the dog's presence, settled into a more relaxed position by the fire. The room had become their sanctuary, a small, fragile bubble of safety amid the chaos outside. The warmth in the cabin was almost too much after the cold that had gripped them all day. But it was also what they needed. The danger had not passed. They were not out of the storm yet. "What's your name?" Sophia asked, her voice still trembling from the fear, but she tried to hold herself together. She wasn't used to seeing strangers in the house, much less strangers who had clearly been through so much. The man's eyes, bloodshot and weary, flickered open as he looked at her. His voice came out rough, barely a whisper. "Jacob." He paused, his words coming slower now, his breath more labored. "Jacob Flynn." Ethan studied him, then nodded slightly. "Jacob, you're safe for now. We'll get you patched up, but I need you to stay still. Can you do that?" Jacob didn't answer immediately, his eyes closing again, as if the effort of speaking had drained him. Shadow moved closer to Ethan, sensing the tension in the air. Ethan looked back at the girls, his expression serious. "Stay close to the fire and stay quiet. I don't know if we're completely safe yet." Lily's small hand tightened around her sister's, and her eyes flickered toward the door. "What if someone comes?" "We'll deal with it," Ethan replied, his voice firm. He rose from his position, his body groaning from exhaustion, and moved toward the stranger. Jacob's condition was worsening. He could see it in the way the man's breathing became erratic. Ethan knelt beside Jacob and carefully began to assess the injury, using a flashlight to check for any signs of internal damage. His hands moved quickly, the soldiers' training taking over. The blood was flowing too freely for it to be a simple wound. "You're going to be all right," Ethan muttered under his breath, more to reassure himself than anyone else. He knew the stakes. If Jacob died here, it wouldn't just be another casualty to the storm. It would be a loss they couldn't afford. They needed each other to survive. The girls sat quietly by the fire, eyes wide, unsure of what to do. The heavy snowstorm continued its assault on the world outside, but inside, the room was filled with a sense of hushed anticipation. There were still many unknowns about Jacob's fate, about the storm, about what was waiting outside. The warmth of the fire and the sense of safety they felt began to lull the girls into a fragile sense of peace. But Sophia, who hadn't taken her eyes off the door, suddenly tensed. She whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "Did you hear that?" Ethan's attention snapped to the door. The wind howled so fiercely outside that it was hard to differentiate between the storm's noise and anything else. But there it was again, a faint sound, a knock. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Ethan's hand instinctively went to the rifle at his side as Shadow growled low, sensing the shift in energy. Lily's face turned pale. She clung to her sister, eyes wide with fear. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice shaky. Ethan stood slowly, his eyes narrowed. He motioned for the girls to stay by the fire, and his movements were cautious as he approached the door. The knocking came again, softer this time, but the message was clear. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. Ethan crouched by the door, listening. His mind raced. The storm would drown out the sound of footsteps, but they had already been through too much to risk a stranger at the door. It could be anyone, friend or foe. He had to be careful. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice low but firm. A familiar voice answered from the other side, muffled by the storm. "It's me, Noah," the man said, his voice strained but recognizable. Ethan's posture relaxed slightly, though his guard remained up. Noah had been part of the same unit during the war. He was reliable, but even so, Ethan knew better than to trust everything that came knocking at his door. Still, the name was a brief respite, like a flicker of light in the darkness. "Stay inside," Ethan ordered, turning to look at the girls who were now huddled together. "Stay by the fire. Don't move until I say so." He opened the door slowly, keeping his rifle ready, and in the doorway stood Noah, his clothes soaked through, his face gaunt, and his eyes wide with urgency. "Ethan, we've got trouble," Noah said, his voice low but urgent. "The scavengers, they're closing in." The cold air rushed in as Ethan opened the door wider, the blizzard outside crashing against the small cabin. Noah stood on the threshold, his figure almost lost in the swirling snow, but his expression was clear. He was no longer the soldier Ethan had once known. His face was weary, his body thinner than it had been before the war, but the urgency in his eyes was unmistakable. "What do you mean, closing in?" Ethan asked, his tone sharp but low, careful not to alert the girls to the danger outside. Noah stepped inside, quickly shaking the snow from his coat. "The scavengers. They've been tracking me for miles. I thought I lost them, but they've been getting closer. I don't know how long we have before they find us." Ethan's mind raced. The girls were inside, safe, for now. But if the scavengers found them, there wouldn't be time to escape. Not with the storm, not in this cold. He glanced at the small room where the girls were huddled, their eyes wide with fear as they sensed the shift in the air. Noah closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment, his breath heavy from the cold. "We need to move, now," Ethan said, his voice firm, but with a hint of something deeper, something that spoke to the bond he had formed with this small group of survivors. The storm outside wasn't their only threat. Noah looked at Ethan, his brow furrowed. "Where do we go? This place won't hold, not if they're as close as you say." Ethan paused, his gaze drifting to the fire crackling in the corner. The warmth from the flames was a stark contrast to the freezing cold outside. but that warmth couldn't protect them if the scavengers broke through. "The old church," Ethan said suddenly, a plan forming in his mind. "It's isolated, and the roof's still intact. We can fortify it. At least we can buy some time there." Noah nodded, understanding the gravity of the decision. "All right, we move out now. I'll take the lead." Ethan turned to the girls, his voice softening. "You two, gather what you need quickly, we're leaving." Lily, her face pale and eyes wide, clung to her sister as Sophia nodded, her small hands trembling. They had seen enough of this world to understand that staying put wasn't an option. They knew what danger looked like now, and they were ready to follow Ethan, the only protector they had. "Where's Shadow?" Noah asked, looking around the cabin. Ethan nodded toward the dog, who had been standing by the fire, its keen eyes watching the room. Shadow seemed to sense the rising tension as well, and the dog padded over to Ethan, ready for action. Ethan patted the dog's head, and the animal gave a low growl, sensing the danger outside. "Shadow's got our back," Ethan said simply. As they quickly gathered their things, the howling wind outside intensified, as though the storm itself was trying to stop them. The sky was already darkening, and the snow had thickened, turning the world outside into a white, featureless expanse. "Let's move," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. They made their way to the door, stepping outside into the howling storm. Noah led the way, his figure barely visible in the swirling snow, and Ethan followed closely behind, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings. Shadow remained close to them, always alert, always ready to protect. Lily and Sophia, now wrapped in their worn-out coats, stayed close to Ethan, the harsh wind biting at their exposed faces. The cold seemed to penetrate to their very bones, but they kept moving, driven by the one thing they had left: hope. As they moved through the snow, the weight of the situation began to press down on them. Each step was slow, each breath a struggle against the cold, but the old church was only a mile away, and Ethan had every intention of getting there. But as they rounded a corner, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the snow, and Ethan's body stiffened. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the storm. Something was coming. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice sharp. Shadow growled low, moving into position ahead of them. Noah turned, his face grim. "How far?" "Too close," Ethan replied, his eyes scanning the darkened streets ahead. The scavengers had found them. They were coming for the girls. They were coming for him. The faint, erratic sounds of distant shouting began to reach them, barely audible over the wind. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his instincts telling him to move faster. But they had to be careful. One wrong move, one misstep, and it would be over. The church was in sight now, its shadow looming against the dark sky, but they wouldn't make it there unnoticed. "Noah, take the girls inside. I'll hold them off," Ethan said, his voice firm. "No," Noah replied instantly. "We move together." Ethan shook his head. "It's too dangerous. Just go. I'll be right behind you." Noah hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right. Stay alive, you hear me?" Ethan gave a single nod before turning to face the oncoming threat. Shadow stood beside him, ready for whatever was to come. The storm continued to rage around them, but in that moment it was as if the world had narrowed down to just this fight for survival. The footsteps were closer now. Ethan could hear them clearly. And then, through the swirling snow, the figures emerged, men, ragged and armed, coming toward them with malicious intent. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle, and he steadied his breath. The fight for survival was about to begin. The air around them grew tense as the figures of the scavengers began to take shape through the snowstorm. There were 5 of them, their breath visible in the freezing air, their eyes sharp and focused on the group ahead. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened as he took a step forward, his eyes scanning their movements, analyzing every detail. These weren't just men desperate for shelter, they were predators, hunting for their next victims. Shadow growled low beside him, the dog's muscles taut with readiness. Ethan could feel the dog's instincts echoing his own. Every fiber of his being was alert, ready for action. Noah, keeping a firm hold on Lily and Sophia, was already heading toward the door of the church, his steps quick but cautious. Ethan's gaze followed them for a moment, watching as they approached the entrance. The girls were safe for now, but that wouldn't last long. He had to buy them time. "You know what to do, Shadow," Ethan murmured. The dog nodded, moving with silent precision toward the right side of the street, ready to flank the scavengers. Ethan took a deep breath, pulling his coat tighter around him against the biting cold. He needed to make sure the girls had enough time to get inside the church, away from the immediate danger. The scavengers didn't seem to notice him at first, their focus entirely on the two girls and the stranger. But then one of them, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, caught sight of Ethan. His eyes flickered with recognition, and a cruel smirk spread across his face. "Well, well, what do we have here?" the man said, his voice thick with contempt. "A soldier and a couple of little rats hiding in the snow." Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped into the middle of the street, raising his rifle in a smooth motion, his eyes narrowing. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "This isn't your fight." The leader of the scavengers chuckled darkly, his hand resting on the handle of a knife at his waist. "Oh, but it is. You see, soldiers like you are exactly what we're looking for. You've got what we need." Ethan's eyes flickered toward the girls one last time. Noah had gotten them inside, and the door to the church slammed shut. They were safe, for now. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. The leader of the scavengers stepped forward, his posture aggressive. "Hand over everything, your supplies, your food, and you," he said, nodding toward the door. "You're not leaving this place alive." Ethan's jaw clenched. He wasn't afraid of the fight. He'd been in far worse situations, but this time the stakes were different. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for those little girls, for the only family that had trusted him, and he wasn't going to let them down. Shadow barked once, his growl low and threatening. The dog was ready to strike, but Ethan held up a hand to calm him. They had to do this smartly. He couldn't risk drawing the entire group into a full confrontation, but if they came any closer... Without warning, the leader lunged forward, pulling his knife from its sheath. Ethan reacted instinctively, his rifle coming up to block the incoming strike. The scavenger's knife clanged against the barrel, and the two men struggled for control. Ethan's body reacted with trained precision. He twisted, pushing the scavenger's arm aside, and in one swift motion, he used the rifle's butt to knock the man off balance. The leader stumbled back, but Ethan wasn't finished. He moved fast, stepping toward the man and delivering a powerful elbow to his chest. The leader fell hard onto the snowy ground, gasping for air. But the other scavengers were closing in, realizing the fight was on. Ethan swung his rifle back around just as one of the others pulled a handgun, aiming it directly at him. The shot rang out in the storm, but Ethan was faster. He ducked, rolling into the snow and coming up on his knees, his rifle aimed and ready. The scavenger with the gun hesitated for just a moment, his eyes wide in surprise. That split second was enough. Ethan fired, the shot piercing through the air and hitting the man's shoulder. He dropped his weapon, stumbling backward into the snow. Shadow pounced, taking down one of the remaining scavengers in a burst of motion, the dog's teeth sinking into the man's arm. The man screamed in pain, trying to shake the dog off, but Shadow held firm, never relenting. The other two scavengers hesitated, but fear was already setting in. "Run!" one of them shouted, turning to flee into the storm. The remaining man followed, dragging the one who had been bitten by Shadow with him. But Ethan wasn't going to let them go so easily. He stood up, aiming his rifle at the last scavenger still standing. The man froze, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't want to kill you," Ethan said, his voice firm but low. "But if you don't leave, I will." The man's breath came in ragged gasps, but his resolve crumbled. Without a word, he turned and bolted into the storm, disappearing into the snow. Ethan lowered his rifle, his heart pounding from the fight. He turned to the church door, making sure the girls were still safe inside. Shadow trotted back to his side, shaking the snow from his fur as if nothing had happened. The soldier gave the dog a grateful pat. "Good job, boy," he muttered. The cabin was eerily quiet now, the sound of the storm muffled by the thick walls. The tension in the air lingered, but the immediate danger had passed. Ethan walked toward the door of the church and knocked twice. "You're safe," he said, his voice low. "You can come out now." The door creaked open slowly and Noah stepped out, his face still tense, but relieved. He gave Ethan a small nod. The girls appeared behind him, their faces a little less fearful, but still filled with uncertainty. Lily clung to Sophia's side, her small hand gripping her sister's sleeve as she peered out from behind the door. "You're all right?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We're all right," Ethan confirmed, giving her a reassuring smile. "We made it through the storm, and we'll make it through whatever comes next." As the wind howled outside and the fire crackled warmly in the church behind them, the small group stood together in silence for a moment, united in their survival, with a fragile hope that the worst was behind them. But Ethan knew better. The storm was still raging, and their journey was far from over. The howling wind outside seemed to intensify, a cruel reminder of the harsh world they lived in. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and the cold seemed to press in even closer, seeping through the walls of the old church. But for now they were safe. The scavengers had been driven off, and though their presence still lingered in the air, it was the warmth of the fire and the quiet moments between the survivors that filled the room. Ethan stood at the door, watching the snow drift past the cracked windows. His mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not yet. The scavengers would be back, and when they returned, they'd be more vicious, more determined. Noah stepped up beside him, breaking the silence. "You think they're gone for good?" Ethan shook his head, his eyes narrowing against the wind. "No, they'll be back. They're not the type to give up easily. We need to be ready." Noah exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "I thought I lost them when I took that detour, but I guess I was wrong." "You did what you had to," Ethan replied quietly. "We all did." Inside the church, the girls were sitting near the fire, their small bodies huddled together for warmth. The fire crackled and popped, but the warmth didn't seem to reach their eyes. They were safe, yes, but the trauma of what they had been through still clung to them. Their innocent faces were marked by the fear they had lived through, and though they were physically unharmed, the emotional scars would take longer to heal. Ethan's gaze softened as he looked toward them. He could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty that came from living in a world like this. It was something he knew all too well. "They need more than safety," he murmured to Noah. "They need peace. They need hope." Noah didn't reply at first, his gaze drifting to the two girls. His expression was a mix of concern and helplessness. "How do we give them that?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind focused. "We survive, we protect them, and we show them there's more to life than running from danger." Noah nodded, but there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. "I hope you're right." Ethan turned back to face the room. The girls were asleep now, huddled close to each other on the floor, their breathing steady despite the cold. Shadow lay beside them, his watchful eyes scanning the room. Ethan had no doubt the dog would alert him to any danger, but for now they were safe. And that was something he would hold on to for as long as he could. But safety was fleeting in this world. The hours passed slowly. The storm outside seemed endless, and the fire inside was barely enough to keep the cold at bay. As the night wore on, Ethan's mind raced through every possible scenario. He could feel the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. He was their protector now, their only hope. Noah moved over to a corner of the church, sitting down with his back against the stone wall. His eyes were closed, his face tense. The strain of the day had clearly taken its toll on him, but Ethan couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. The door of the church creaked open slightly, and Shadow immediately stood, his ears alert. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in hand, but when he turned to face the door, it was only a familiar face stepping inside. "Jacob," Ethan said, lowering his weapon. The injured man from earlier stood in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes held a fierce determination. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said hoarsely, stepping inside. "You're right. I'm not just running anymore." Ethan raised an eyebrow, studying Jacob carefully. The man was still bleeding, but the wound seemed less dire than before. He had managed to bandage himself, but it was clear he had a long road to recovery. "Don't get ahead of yourself," Ethan cautioned. "You're not out of the woods yet." Jacob nodded, his face grim. "I know, but I can't just sit here. I want to help. I owe you for saving me." Ethan studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching the man's face. Jacob's words weren't just gratitude, they were something more. A plea for purpose, a desire to contribute in a world where survival was the only thing that mattered. "You want to help?" Ethan asked. "Then help us prepare for what's coming. We'll need everything we've got." Jacob's face hardened with resolve. "I'm with you." The two men stood in silence for a moment, each understanding the weight of the situation. The scavengers would come back, and when they did, they would be ready. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the walls of the old church, a small, fragile bond was forming. In this world of chaos and despair, the survivors had each other, and together they would find a way to survive. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the storm outside intensifying with every passing hour. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the church, and the snow piled up higher against the doors. The fire crackled weakly in the corner, offering little comfort against the cold that still seeped through the cracks in the stone walls. But inside, amidst the bleak surroundings, a tentative sense of calm had settled over the group. The girls were asleep now, curled up together by the fire. Shadow lay beside them, his body tense, always alert, but his presence offered some reassurance. Noah was dozing in a corner, his hand resting on the rifle he had kept close all evening. Jacob sat near the fire, his face pale but determined, his wound bandaged but still obviously painful. Ethan remained, standing, his back against the cold wall near the door, his rifle resting loosely in his hands. His eyes flickered to the girls, and then to Jacob. There was something in the air, an unspoken tension that lingered even in the silence. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before their situation became even more dangerous. He glanced at the door, the wind howling louder now, almost as if it were trying to warn them of the impending danger. They had to act soon. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. "We need to move," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but firm. "The scavengers will be back. We can't wait for them to find us." Noah stirred from his spot in the corner, his eyes wide as he met Ethan's gaze. "Where do we go?" he asked. His voice was still rough from the storm, but the urgency in his words was clear. "We can't just keep running." Ethan sighed, his eyes flicking to the girls who were still asleep. They were safe for now, but for how long? The scavengers would stop at nothing. He knew they needed to move, but the question was where. "The only place we might be able to defend is the old watchtower," Ethan said, his voice low but resolute. "It's further north, a few miles from here. It's isolated, and the walls are high. It's not ideal, but it's the best we have." Jacob, who had been sitting silently by the fire, suddenly stood up. His face was tense, his eyes hardening. "The watchtower," he muttered, almost as if to himself. "I know the place. It's been abandoned for years, but if you think it'll help us—" Ethan nodded. "It's the best option we've got. We move now." The wind outside screamed louder than before, a furious reminder of the storm's power. But inside the church, the group moved swiftly, gathering their few belongings and preparing to leave. The fire flickered one last time before it was doused, the room plunging into a cold, dim darkness. Shadow stood up, his ears alert, his tail stiff with anticipation. The dog knew what was coming, and Ethan could feel the weight of his bond with the animal. They had been through so much together, and now they faced yet another challenge. Ethan turned to Noah and Jacob. "Keep close. We'll move as quickly as we can, but we can't risk drawing attention." Noah gave a nod, and Jacob followed suit, though the strain on his face was clear. The pain from his wound was making it difficult for him to move as quickly as the rest, but he didn't complain. He was a soldier at heart, and he understood what was at stake. The door creaked open, and the blinding whiteness of the snowstorm hit them immediately. The wind howled around them as they stepped into the storm, the snow whipping against their faces. Shadow led the way, moving with purpose, as Ethan and the others followed closely behind. Each step felt like a battle, the cold gnawing at their skin and the wind, threatening to knock them off balance. They had to push through the storm, the snow falling in thick sheets that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. As they moved, Ethan's thoughts were constantly on the girls. He couldn't afford to lose them. They were the only hope left in a world that had forgotten how to care. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure they were still behind him, their small figures barely visible in the blinding snow. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of the forest where the watchtower was located. The trees had been stripped bare by the storm, their branches creaking under the weight of the snow. The watchtower stood in the distance, a dark silhouette against the pale sky. It was even more imposing up close, its stone walls towering over them. "Stay quiet," Ethan instructed, his voice barely audible over the storm. "We don't know if anyone is inside." They crept toward the watchtower, careful not to make a sound. Shadow led the way, his paws barely making a sound in the snow. Ethan's rifle was ready, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. Every step they took felt like a risk, but they had no choice. As they approached the door, Shadow paused, his ears perked, his eyes focused on something in the distance. The dog growled low, a warning. Ethan held up his hand, signaling for everyone to stop. "Stay back," Ethan whispered, his heart racing. He took a step forward, his rifle raised, as he scanned the area. The wind howled louder, the snow thickening, but nothing else moved. The door to the watchtower was cracked open, just enough for Ethan to see inside. He couldn't risk going in without knowing what was waiting for them. "I'll go in first," Ethan said. "Stay here." No one objected. Shadow followed closely behind as Ethan carefully pushed the door open, his body tense and ready for whatever might be inside. The darkness beyond the door was suffocating, but as Ethan stepped inside, he felt a brief sense of relief. The walls of the watchtower were still intact, and there was a small fire burning in the corner, casting faint light across the stone floor. Ethan motioned for the others to follow, his rifle ready. As they stepped inside, he closed the door behind them, sealing out the storm. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were safe. But Ethan knew better than to relax. This was only the beginning. The storm had subsided, but new dangers loomed on the horizon. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder of the storm that still raged beyond the walls of the watchtower. Inside, the small fire flickered weakly, casting a dim light across the room. The walls, made of stone, were thick, but they offered little comfort against the chill that still clung to the air. Despite the relative safety of the watchtower, tension filled the room like an invisible force. Ethan paced the small space, his mind focused on the situation. The scavengers weren't far behind. They would be out there, searching for them, and if they didn't act quickly, it was only a matter of time before they found the watchtower. The girls were huddled near the fire, still shaken from the journey and the terror they had endured in the storm. Shadow, ever vigilant, lay by the door, his head turned toward Ethan as if waiting for an order. Noah and Jacob were sitting against the cold stone walls, both silent, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Jacob's injury was still a concern, but he refused to admit weakness. He had always been that way, strong, determined, but worn down by the harsh reality of survival. "We're safe here for the moment," Ethan said, his voice breaking the silence. He turned to Noah, his eyes narrowing. "But we can't stay, not for long." Noah looked up, his face tired, but resolute. "I know, but we need a plan. We can't just keep running." Ethan nodded. "We'll head for the mountains tomorrow. It's the only place they won't be able to follow us. We'll need to cross the river, and then the forest. But if we're going to make it, we need to move fast." Jacob shifted in his seat, his eyes weary but focused. "What if they're already waiting for us?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold. Ethan turned to him, his gaze firm. "They won't be expecting us to head for the mountains. We'll use the terrain to our advantage. The snowstorm has already covered our tracks, so we have a small window to make it out undetected." Jacob considered this for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. It's our best shot." The girls were quiet, listening intently to the conversation, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and uncertainty. Lily clung to her sister, her small hands trembling. "I'm scared, Ethan," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan kneeled beside them, his expression softening. "I know, Sophia, but you're safe here. We're all going to make it through this." Lily looked up at him, her blue eyes wide and full of questions. "How do you know?" Ethan paused, his heart aching for the innocence that still remained in the little girl, despite everything she had seen. "Because we're not giving up. No matter what happens, we keep going. We have each other." Sophia nodded, wiping her eyes. "We'll keep going." Ethan smiled, a brief flash of warmth in his cold, battle-worn features. He stood up, glancing around the room. "We'll rest here tonight. Tomorrow, we move out before the storm picks up again. Shadow will keep watch. We'll take shifts. No one sleeps too deeply." The night passed slowly, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the cold, dark room. As the fire died down, the temperature in the room dropped, and the group huddled together for warmth, their breaths visible in the air. Ethan stood by the door, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, but he refused to show any weakness. The girls needed him, the men needed him, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. Shadow growled low, his ears twitching. Ethan turned, his hand on the rifle at his side, his eyes narrowing. Something was out there. Someone was moving in the snow. He signaled for the others to stay down and moved cautiously toward the door, Shadow at his side. The dog's growl grew louder, its body tense with alertness. Ethan reached for the door, pushing it open just a crack, his eyes scanning the white landscape. The storm had died down a little, the snow falling in light, steady flurries. But even in the relative calm, Ethan knew the danger was still out there. He stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow, the cold biting at his face. He looked around, his rifle raised, ready for anything. Shadow followed him closely, its keen eyes scanning every shadow. The sound of footsteps reached his ears, soft, slow, deliberate. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. A figure emerged from the storm, cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the heavy snow. But Ethan could make out the shape, a man, or what seemed to be a man, moving toward the watchtower. No words were exchanged, but the tension in the air was palpable. Shadow bared its teeth, but Ethan held up a hand, signaling for the dog to stay back. The man took a few more steps forward, and as he did, the wind cleared the snow around him, revealing his face. It was scarred, hardened by time, but Ethan recognized him instantly. Noah gasped behind him. "It's him! It's Jacob!" Ethan didn't respond. The man before them was the same man who had stumbled into the church earlier that day, injured and lost, but now he was standing outside in the snowstorm, alive and, by all appearances, seeking refuge. The man stopped in front of Ethan, his expression unreadable. He was breathing heavily, his body shaking from the cold, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a cold determination. "I've been waiting for you," the man said, his voice rough but clear. "You don't know who you're up against." The storm had settled, but the tension inside the watchtower remained thick, hanging in the air like an impending thunderstorm. Ethan stood at the door, his rifle still in hand, as the man, Jacob, gazed back at him. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but Ethan couldn't yet read the intent behind them. "You've been waiting for me?" Ethan asked, his voice cautious, his eyes scanning the stranger's face for any hint of danger. Jacob's expression was grim, his weathered features betraying no emotion. The wind still howled outside, but the small room had an eerie quiet now. Shadow stood beside Ethan, his body tense, ears flicking back at the mention of Jacob's cryptic words. "I've been tracking the scavengers," Jacob said, his voice rough, as if the very act of speaking was an effort. "I know what they're capable of, and I know they're going to come for us, soon. You've got to get ready." Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened, but he didn't lower it. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "What do you mean they're coming for us?" Jacob's gaze flickered briefly toward the inside of the church, where Lily and Sophia were resting. He seemed to recognize the vulnerability in the girls, something that made his face darken. "You didn't see it before, did you?" Jacob continued, his voice dropping as if sharing a secret. "They're organized. They have scouts out in the field. They know where we are." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The words hit him like a punch. The scavengers weren't just roaming aimlessly, they were hunting. They had a plan, and they weren't going to stop until they had everything. Ethan took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "How do you know this?" Jacob seemed to hesitate for a moment, looking around the room, but the weight of his knowledge was too great to hide. "I've been part of their group," Jacob said quietly, almost ashamed. "I know how they think, how they move. They won't stop. They'll come here. They'll take what they want." Ethan's mind spun with the implications of Jacob's words. He didn't trust the man completely. His injuries, his cryptic nature, and his sudden appearance all raised flags in Ethan's mind. But there was something in Jacob's eyes that told Ethan he wasn't lying. And if the scavengers were indeed hunting them, there was no time to waste. Ethan lowered his rifle slowly, the tension in his body still coiled, but his voice was steady. "Then we don't wait for them. We make a plan. We move now." Jacob nodded, a small, tired smile flickering at the corner of his lips. "Smart move. They won't expect us to leave. The mountains are our best bet, but we'll need to move quickly." Ethan turned to Noah, who had been standing silently by the fire, listening intently. His face was drawn with fatigue, but his eyes were sharp, and he met Ethan's gaze with understanding. "I'll get the girls ready," Noah said, his voice low but resolute. Ethan nodded, turning back to Jacob. "You're with us now. No more running. If we're doing this, we do it together." Jacob didn't respond right away, but his expression softened for a brief moment. "I'm with you. Whatever it takes." The plan was simple, but not without risks. The mountains were their last chance. If they could make it there, they would be able to escape the scavengers. But the journey wouldn't be easy. They would have to cross dangerous terrain, through dense forests, across frozen rivers, and up steep paths. It would be exhausting, but it was the only chance they had. Ethan glanced at Shadow, who had been quietly sitting near the door, watching him with intelligent eyes. The dog was ready. The bond between them had been forged in the heat of battle, and now it was stronger than ever. With Shadow by his side, Ethan felt more confident, but even so he couldn't ignore the weight of the responsibility resting on his shoulders. He turned to the girls who were still huddled by the fire, looking small and fragile in the corner. Sophia was clinging to Lily, her hands shaking, but the girls were resilient. They had been through so much already. "Listen," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We're leaving. We're heading for the mountains, and I need you to stick close to me. Do you understand?" Lily nodded, her eyes wide, filled with both fear and hope. "We'll follow you, Ethan," she whispered. Ethan's heart ached at the sight of the little girl, but he gave her a reassuring smile. "You're stronger than you know." Noah stepped forward, joining Ethan as he turned back toward the door. "We'll head out before first light," he said. "That's our best chance." Jacob stood up, his face set in determination. "We won't have much time. We need to be ready for anything." Ethan turned to Shadow and gave the dog a soft pat on the head. "Stay close, boy. We're in this together." Shadow wagged his tail once, his body tense with anticipation. The group gathered their few belongings, preparing for the journey ahead. The wind outside was still howling, but inside there was a sense of unity that had been absent before. They were no longer just survivors. They were a team. As the fire in the church died down, the group took their positions by the door, ready to face whatever dangers the storm and the scavengers would throw at them. The night was dark, the snow swirling outside, but they knew what had to be done. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would fight, they would survive, and they would face the world together.